Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, 2011. Part 1. Two Systems. Your mind operates with two distinct systems that shape every thought and decision. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and emotional, working effortlessly without conscious control, like detecting hostility in a voice or completing the phrase bread and. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical, and logical, requiring conscious effort and attention, like solving a complex math problem or filling out a tax form. These two systems constantly interact, with System 1 generating impressions and feelings that System 2 usually endorses with little scrutiny. Recognizing when System 1 is leading you astray and when to engage System 2 is essential for better thinking. System 1 is generally excellent at what it does, but it is also prone to systematic errors that you can learn to anticipate and guard against. Attention and effort are limited resources, and your brain is fundamentally lazy when it comes to engaging System 2. Cognitive ease describes your natural preference for tasks that require less mental effort, while cognitive strain signals that System 2 needs to be engaged. Pupil dilation physically measures mental effort, expanding when you are working hard to solve a problem. The law of least effort applies to cognition just as it does to physical movement. You naturally gravitate toward the path of least resistance. When System 1 can provide a quick answer, System 2 often accepts it without checking the logic, leading to errors that could have been avoided with just a little more effort. Recognizing when the stakes are high enough to justify the effort of engaging System 2 is crucial. Intuitive judgments are often based on associations your mind makes automatically, without your awareness. Priming occurs when exposure to one idea unconsciously influences your thoughts and actions, as demonstrated when people exposed to words related to old age walked more slowly down the hall without realizing why. Your mind is a machine for jumping to conclusions, constantly making associations and predictions based on available information with little conscious control. The coherence you experience in the world is largely constructed by System 1, which fills in gaps and creates stories that make sense, even when the evidence is thin. Being skeptical of first impressions is wise, because they may be based on associations you do not even recognize. Cognitive ease and cognitive strain affect your judgments in predictable ways. When in a state of cognitive ease, you are more likely to be intuitive, creative, and trusting, but also more prone to errors. When in a state of cognitive strain, you are more vigilant, analytical, and skeptical, but also more mentally fatigued. Mood plays a significant role. When you are happy, System 1 is more dominant, and you are more likely to be fooled by cognitive biases. When slightly anxious or uncomfortable, System 2 is more engaged, and you make more accurate judgments. The environment in which you make decisions matters enormously, and you can influence your own thinking by managing your state of mind. Recognizing when you need cognitive strain and creating conditions that support it helps you think more clearly. Your mind is designed to jump to conclusions based on limited information, a tendency called what you see is all there is. System 1 constructs the best story it can from the information available and acts as if that story is complete, ignoring what it does not know. This explains why you make confident predictions based on thin evidence and why you're surprised when things turn out differently than expected. The coherence-seeking nature of System 1 means you will always prefer a simple, consistent story over a complicated, ambiguous one, even when the simple story is wrong. Asking yourself what evidence is missing, what you are not seeing, and how the story might change with more information is one of the hardest mental habits to develop, because it goes against your natural cognitive wiring. Your mind has a remarkable capacity for framing, and the way a question is posed dramatically affects your answer. Framing effects show how logically equivalent descriptions can lead to completely different choices depending on whether they are presented in terms of gains or losses. You are more willing to take risks to avoid losses than to achieve gains, even when the mathematical outcomes are identical. Loss aversion is one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making. The frames presented to you are often designed to exploit this tendency, and reframing problems in multiple ways before deciding protects you from manipulation. The same information packaged differently can lead you to opposite conclusions, and only by consciously examining the frame can you escape its influence. Part 2. Heuristics and Biases. The anchoring effect describes how your judgments are influenced by arbitrary numbers or information that should have no bearing on your decision. In the classic experiment, people spun a wheel of fortune and then estimated the percentage of African nations in the UN, and their estimates were heavily influenced by the random number from the wheel. Anchoring works because System 1 automatically considers the anchor as a possibility, and System 2 then adjusts from that starting point. But the adjustment is usually insufficient. You are anchored by asking prices in negotiations, by suggested donations, by any number that enters your mind before you make a judgment. Defending against anchoring requires actively considering alternative anchors and consciously rejecting the influence of numbers that should not matter. The availability heuristic leads you to judge the frequency or probability of events by how easily examples come to mind. This heuristic is generally useful because frequent events are usually easier to recall, but it leads you astray when memory is biased by media coverage or personal experience. Plane crashes come to mind more easily than car crashes because they are more dramatic and heavily reported, leading you to overestimate the danger of flying. Recent events are more available than distant ones, vivid events more available than mundane ones. This heuristic shapes your perceptions of risk, your judgments of others, and your decisions about your own life. Questioning whether your mental examples are truly representative or simply more available improves your judgments. The representativeness heuristic leads you to judge probability by similarity, often ignoring base rates and statistical realities. The Linda problem demonstrates how people consistently judge that it is more likely she is a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller, even though this violates basic probability. You are drawn to plausible stories, to things that make sense, even when the statistics tell a different story. This heuristic leads you to see patterns where none exist, to make predictions based on how well a description matches a stereotype, and to ignore the statistical fact that rare things are rare. Training yourself to consider base rates and ask how common something really is before making judgments based on similarity improves accuracy. The law of small numbers describes how you treat small samples as if they were as reliable as large ones. Your mind naturally sees patterns and draws conclusions, even from tiny amounts of data, and this tendency leads to overconfidence and error. A basketball player who makes 3 shots in a row is judged to have a hot hand, even though statistics show that sequences of hits and misses are random. A small town with a high cancer rate is investigated for environmental causes, even though small samples naturally vary more than large ones. Small samples produce extreme results more often than large ones, and conclusions drawn from limited data should not be trusted. The law of large numbers is reliable, but the law of small numbers is a cognitive illusion. Regression to the mean is the statistical tendency for extreme outcomes to be followed by more average ones. Flight instructors believed that praise led to worse performance because after a good landing, the next one was usually worse, while criticism seemed to improve performance because after a bad landing, the next one was usually better. They did not understand regression. Performance naturally fluctuates around an average, and extreme performances are likely to be followed by less extreme ones. Regression appears everywhere once you know to look for it, yet people constantly invent causal explanations for statistical phenomena. Being careful not to reward or punish based on outcomes that are actually just random variation prevents misattribution. Recognizing that extreme success is likely to be followed by something less extreme, whether you do anything or not, keeps expectations realistic. Taming intuitive predictions requires forcing yourself to consider base rates and to be less confident than you feel. When making predictions based on intuition, you are usually too extreme and too confident because you focus on the specific case and ignore the general pattern. Better predictions start with the base rate, then adjust based on specific information, but only as much as the evidence warrants. Thinking in terms of ranges and probabilities rather than single-point estimates improves accuracy. Your intuition is calibrated for the world of System 1, not for statistical prediction, and systematic procedures are needed to overcome natural biases. Good predictions come from combining statistical thinking with specific knowledge, not from trusting either one alone. Part 3. Overconfidence. The illusion of understanding is the belief that you understand the past and can predict the future based on stories that make sense after the fact. Your mind constantly constructs narratives to explain what has happened, and these narratives make the past seem more predictable than it actually was. Hindsight bias leads you to believe that you knew it all along, and that others should have seen what was coming. These narratives become the basis for your predictions about the future, giving you false confidence in your ability to forecast. The world is far more random and complex than your stories suggest, and the past makes sense only in retrospect, because you have selected one path among many. The illusion of understanding is comforting but dangerous, and holding your beliefs lightly and with humility is wiser. The illusion of validity is the confidence that comes from a coherent story, even when the evidence is weak. Kahneman's experience interviewing candidates for officer training, believing he could predict their future success based on brief observations, illustrates this. Years later, he learned that his predictions were essentially useless, but at the time his confidence was unshakable because his mind created coherent stories from limited information. When you have a compelling narrative, you feel certain, even when the narrative has no predictive power. This explains why experts are often no better than chance at predicting complex outcomes, yet they remain confident because their stories make sense. Distinguishing between situations where patterns are real and repeatable, and situations where you are just telling yourself a story requires seeking feedback, tracking predictions, and being humble about forecasting ability. The planning fallacy is the tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take and how much they will cost, even when you have evidence from similar projects. The planning fallacy occurs because you focus on your specific plan and ignore the outside view, the base rates of how long such projects typically take. The Sydney Opera House was supposed to cost $7 million and take 6 years. It cost $102 million and took 14 years. This pattern repeats endlessly because planners focus on unique circumstances and ignore the statistical reality that most projects overrun. Overcoming the planning fallacy requires deliberately adopting the outside view, asking how long similar projects have taken, and assuming yours will be similar. Building in margins of safety protects against plans that are almost certainly too optimistic. Irrational optimism drives much of human endeavor, serving as the engine of capitalism and the source of many failures. Most people are irrationally optimistic about their own futures, believing they are less likely than average to be divorced, have a heart attack, or be in a car accident. This optimism leads entrepreneurs to start businesses despite high failure rates, and investors to trade despite evidence that most lose money. Optimism is adaptive because it motivates action and resilience, but it also leads to taking risks that are not justified by the odds. Balancing optimism with realism means believing that you can succeed while acknowledging the probabilities. Optimism with your eyes open, believing in your ability to handle whatever comes while being realistic about the likelihood of different outcomes, is the goal. Part 4. Choices. Prospect theory is the foundation of behavioral economics, explaining how you actually make decisions under uncertainty. Kahneman and Tversky developed this theory to explain why people systematically violate the rational model of choice. The theory shows that you evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, usually your current situation, and that losses loom larger than gains. You are risk-averse when considering gains and risk-seeking when considering losses, leading people to take greater risks to avoid a loss than to achieve a gain. Prospect theory also explains the endowment effect, where you value things you own more than identical things you do not own. These patterns are systematic and predictable, and understanding them helps you recognize when emotions are driving your decisions. The fourfold pattern of preferences emerges from prospect theory, predicting how you will behave in different situations. When faced with a high probability of gain, you are risk-averse, preferring a certain smaller gain to a risky larger one. When faced with a high probability of loss, you are risk-seeking, preferring to gamble on avoiding the loss rather than accepting a certain smaller loss. When faced with a low probability of gain, you are risk-seeking, buying lottery tickets and long-shot investments. When faced with a low probability of loss, you are risk-averse, buying insurance against unlikely disasters. Each of these patterns can be reasonable in some contexts, but leads to systematic errors in others. Recognizing which pattern is operating in your current decision helps you ask whether it serves your interests or exploits your biases. Rare events are either overestimated or overweighted, leading to systematic errors in judgment. People tend to overestimate the probability of rare events, like terrorist attacks or plane crashes, because they are vivid and available. But even when the probability is accurately estimated, people often overweight rare events in their decisions, giving them more weight than they deserve. This explains why lottery tickets sell despite terrible odds, and why people buy insurance for unlikely events. The emotional impact of a rare event distorts thinking, making you treat a 1% chance as if it were much larger. Making better decisions requires consciously correcting for this bias, asking what the true expected value is and whether the emotional weight matches the statistical reality. Loss aversion is more powerful than gain-seeking, and this asymmetry shapes countless decisions. The pain of losing a certain amount is about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. This loss aversion explains why you hold losing investments too long, hoping to break even, and sell winning investments too soon, locking in gains. It explains why negotiations are so difficult, why changes are resisted, and why the status quo has such power. Recognizing when loss aversion is leading to irrational choices allows you to ask what you would do if you were not afraid of the loss. Sometimes the rational choice is to accept a loss and move on, but loss aversion keeps you stuck, reframing decisions in terms of what you gain by letting go, not just what you lose by changing. Narrow framing and mental accounting can be used to your advantage rather than letting them trap you. People naturally think in terms of separate mental accounts, treating money differently depending on where it came from or what it is for. You might be willing to gamble with windfall money that you would never risk with savings, even though money is fungible. You might treat a loss in one account as acceptable while being devastated by the same loss in another. Mental accounting can help manage finances by creating useful categories, but it also leads to irrational decisions when you treat money differently based on irrelevant distinctions. Being aware of your mental accounts and asking whether they serve your goals or just create arbitrary barriers improves decisions. Integrating your accounts when making major decisions, looking at your overall financial picture rather than isolated pieces, is the best approach. Part 5. Two Selves. The distinction between your experiencing self and your remembering self reveals two different entities that evaluate your life by different standards. The experiencing self lives in the moment, feeling pleasure and pain as they happen. The remembering self keeps score, constructing stories about your life and making decisions based on memories. The cold presser experiment demonstrated that people rated painful experiences based on their peak and end, ignoring duration. Your remembering self judges experiences by how they felt at their most intense moment and how they felt at the end, a phenomenon called duration neglect. A long period of moderate pain can be remembered as better than a short period of intense pain, even though the total pain was greater. Your decisions about what to do, where to go, and whether to repeat an experience are made by the remembering self, not the experiencing self. creating a fundamental conflict between what you actually feel and what you remember feeling. Your life as you remember it is a story constructed by your remembering self, and this story may not accurately reflect your actual experience. Research shows that people's memories of vacations are dominated by the peak and the end, not by the overall experience, and that they choose future vacations based on these memories. The remembering self is the one that tells the story of your life, that decides whether you are happy, that makes choices about the future. Yet the experiencing self is the one that actually lives those moments, feeling the pleasure and pain as they happen. This creates a paradox. You want to maximize the experience of your experiencing self, but your decisions are made by your remembering self, which cares about different things. Being aware of this split allows you to make conscious choices about which self you are serving. Sometimes prioritizing good memories, even at the cost of momentary discomfort, is wise, while other times focusing on the quality of moment-to-moment experience, even if it does not make a good story, matters more. The implications of the two selves for well-being and happiness are profound, as what you think will make you happy may not actually do so. People consistently mispredict what will bring them satisfaction because they focus on memories rather than experiences. A longer vacation may seem desirable, but if the peak and end are not improved, the extra days may not affect your memory at all. Choosing a job with a prestigious title over one with more enjoyable daily experiences sacrifices your experiencing self for your remembering self story. Gathering more data about your actual experiences, paying attention to how you feel moment to moment, and using that information to make better decisions improves well-being. Happiness is not just about the story you tell at the end, but about the moments you actually live. And finding a balance between serving both selves is essential. Understanding the two selves gives you the power to make more conscious choices about how you spend your time and what you pursue. To show love and appreciation, like, share, and subscribe.